Okay. I believe that's working, so we should be live. Um, there aren't that many people in person here, so if you feel like you need to come in, right, we're not having an issue with overcrowding in the classroom. You don't need to, right, but if that becomes an issue that you'd like to do, if you would like, if the files aren't matching up, we're having a little bit of a problem today because not everything's going to be on the slide, so we're going to try and put the camera on the whiteboard, and we'll see how badly that turns out. We have an exam on Tuesday, right? So there will be no live stream and there will be no office hours. Not that anyone has taken up my office hours. And there will be no class. So you take the exam on Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday. Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. It's 50 minutes long. So make sure you block out an hour to take it. It seems short because it's open note, open book. And I don't want you to just look up every answer. I want you to take the time I want you to know some of these answers, right? I want you to do this in a way that you'd be expected to do it professionally moving forward with your life, right? You need to have most of the answers. That's why you only have a short amount of time for a little over a minute per question, is because most of them you should just know, right? You should know the Bill of Rights. You should know the amendments that you need to know, right? There's a lot of stuff, but a lot of this is American basics, right? Stuff that you're expected to know even before you show up here. So when you have that expectation, a lot of those questions you're expected to know. But when you run into a question, what most exams do is they say, you run into a question you're not sure, just guess, right? I don't like it when people guess, because you can't do that moving forward in your life. When you're in a professional career, you can't just take a guess. You do research, you prepare, you use the resources available to you. So use the resources available to you. Just make sure that you're taking the test, right? It's very difficult to prove that you had help, right? But at the same time, as you're moving forward, if you don't know these basics, it'll be clear that it'll get harder and harder, right? And also my class is very, very easy relative to other courses. So if you feel the need to cheat here, right, that portends badly for what's happening next in your education, right? It is 40 questions. I give you one more question at the end that is sort of extra credit. You should know the answer. It should be very clear. The rest of the exam is multiple choice, right? Most of the time I have three answers that convey basically that, like, similar enough, right? If I ask you about the unusual, cruel and unusual punishment, I'll do like 8th and 6th and 4th, and you're like, it's probably 8th, but then I'll throw in like 31st. Well, the Constitution doesn't have 31 amendments. The federal Constitution doesn't have 31 amendments. So use process of elimination once you get through, right? Make sure you answer them as quickly and as best as you can. Okay, if there are any questions at this time, we're actually gonna go over the exam at the end. If there are any questions at that time, otherwise we're gonna go into the Sagebrush State. So this is Sagebrush State chapters 1 and 2 is the file. Here is, right, for those of you on the live stream, I'm still trying to figure out a way to get these slides to be up, but YouTube took that away. So I'm doing some secondary software, but I'm not allowed to download software on this computer. So we're trying to figure out, I would like you to have the side-by-side with Panopto, but I'd rather you have the live stream than you have to open the slides on your own, right? Because hopefully you can follow along on the slides. We'll see after exam 1. We're going to do like, I was in the Army, we call them after action reviews. So you're going to tell me what are things that can be better, and that way we can update as we move forward. I know at the end of the semester you're going to be asked, but you'll probably never be my student again after this. So it doesn't help to correct it after you're done. We should try and correct it during. Okay. So we're talking about the Sagebrush State. The Sagebrush State is Nevada. We're talking about the history. When we're first talking about this, we're talking about the Great Basin, right? Remember that the state of Nevada doesn't exist yet. You don't have people living here. This is not a climate that people can easily live in. There is not a lot of water availability. The temperatures are very high, right? Not only is there no air conditioning, right? Modern air conditioning sort of changes where people can live, but not only is there no air conditioning, there's no water. There's no water infrastructure. So what would happen is that you would have people come through here during the colder months, right? Because you don't have to worry about the snow and things like that, right? you would come through in the winter, right? And you would come in for fur trapping. Because there are no people, anywhere there are no people, right? The sort of Northwest Passage, right? Through the French and Indian War and sort of what becomes Canada, right? When there's no people, there is a lucrative fur trapping industry. So fur trapping becomes the very first reason that we come in. And then as you're traveling, right, through this area, it becomes that there is a passage to California through this way, right? If you're going up north, you go through the mountains in search of gold. But if you're just going to go down south, right, you can go through a southern portion, right, and then end up in sort of LA, San Diego, what becomes the LA, San Diego region. Now you also have, right, you have Mormons and Christians, right, and sort of the Spanish Empire coming for religious purposes, for conversion, right, for what we call proselytization, right, where you're trying to convert people to your religion. That also happens, but right, the economic reason, the reason why people come in here and sort of move here permanently starts with fur trapping. Then we know historically, right, that parts of Nevada, right, and all of Arizona and sort of California, right, that are originally part of Mexico, right? And then you have this argument of manifest destiny, which we probably won't talk about it much, more of a historical concept. But manifest destiny is just this idea that everything from the East Coast in New York, all Florida, all of that, everything from that eastern coast all the way to the western coast is America, right? Manifest destiny is this argument made, right? This idea of like, go west, my son, that we should all start traveling west and we should just take up that entirety of the nation, right? Everything east to west. Now, obviously, there's some problems with that. First, right, indigenous peoples, right, they lived there, right, and they're moved away. But Andrew Jackson, earlier, before Nevada exists, right, kills off most Indian people through the Trail of Tears or through other ways, right? You have Mexico saying this is territory, but because we're expanding so quickly and we've already become such an economic power, right, Mexico doesn't have the military, the personnel, just the population to compete, and ends up losing and gives away, doesn't give away, is forced to give away that part of the land, right? So then everything east to west becomes America. There's a really big push because what is in the western states is needed for the eastern states. And that sort of changes our behavior, because what we need that is coming up a lot becomes a gold rush, and then in Nevada, a silver rush, right? There are minerals and resources that the East Coast needs, and they need us to go out west, right? One, to ease population burdens, but also to get all of the things that are out here, right? All the timber in the Northwest, and right, all the farmland that's in the Midwest, right? And then here, right, gold and silver, and then what becomes industry and sort of more shipping lanes, and this as the Transcontinental Railroad is finished, right? This ability to cross the nation with industry, right? And goods and services. So then we have this idea that we should take over a lot of areas, but what happens is a man named Brigham Young, he has the idea that he wants to set up a place called Deseret, that it will become this sort of Mormon-controlled area in which the Mormons can have their own faith, their own beliefs, right? And northern Nevada, right? Actually, what is Las Vegas is never part of the Utah territory, but most of Nevada starts out as the Utah territory, right? The Utah territory is this very large territory. The United States government allows the Mormons to set this up, right? Remember that historically, the idea was that states could establish their own religion. The federal government couldn't, but in this time period, it was set up so that states could, right? You could have a Mormon state in the larger federal government, right? So you have this Mormon territory. You have a lot of things about the Mormon territory that are set up that don't really fit with everybody. And so immediately you have some tension. And I'll talk about that when we switch to the whiteboard. I'm going to see if I can move the camera over later. But one of the things is that the Mormons settle near Salt Lake. I'm going to move to the left side. Hopefully it doesn't no, I'm not going to, we'll talk about that in a second, right? So the Mormons settle near Salt Lake. And I know this isn't on the slide, but it's historical narrative, so the slides aren't as helpful in this book that we're using, right? Because there aren't clear definitions I can point to. But what happens is that as they settle in Salt Lake, that becomes their base, right? That becomes where the Mormons concentrate. And then what happens is if you're farther away, if you're in Carson City, if you're in what becomes Northern Nevada, one, typically you're not Mormon because all the Mormons move near Salt Lake, or they move into that what becomes the state of Utah, and they centralize. And their government is based on Mormon rules. So if you're in Carson City and you're not a Mormon, not only do you have very restrictive government, right? This idea that you can't have caffeine, this idea that you shouldn't gamble, right? All of these things that the Nevada government not only allows, but is sort of unique in allowing it today, are things that the Mormons will not allow those non-Mormons to do. More importantly, Mormons discriminate against non-Mormons. You can't get certain jobs. You can't be a judge, right? You have to be Mormon because they establish a Mormon state. If you're not Mormon, you're sort of excluded from certain levels of government, right? And industry, right? People won't work with you. Sometimes we call this social sanctioning. There's an author by the name of Schatzsnyder. He has a book called Semi-Sovereign People, right? When he talks about this, it's not that the government is not allowing you to be in a certain business, right? Not that you can't have a bank, but that the society around you is sanctioning you for not holding the same beliefs or behavior. And so no one will use your bank or no one will go to your shop, right? And so you can't work in that system. What happens is most of the people left in Carson City, they're not Mormons, or they would have moved, or they would have concentrated in what becomes the state of Utah. So this discrimination becomes this first step into this problem about Nevadans, what eventually become Nevadans, feeling like they need to separate. But because it influences, right, we talked about the influence of the crown on what becomes the founding of the United States, right? Why is the Third Amendment you can't house troops in someone's house? Because that's what the British did. Why is it that the Nevada has such liberal policies or such open policies about things like prostitution and gambling and other factors about alcohol, right? Why are we so much more open? Because it was a rejection of Mormon control, right? Historically, people who become Nevadans felt controlled by an outside power, specifically Mormonism, and then because they reject it, what becomes our government becomes a very libertarian government. Right? That's why Nevadans are more libertarians. So I'm going to take a quick aside. I don't think he talks about it as much in this new edition, right? But you have a lot of people coming through Northern Nevada to go west. And they're all following what's called the Humboldt Trail during the Gold Rush. So we start with fur trapping early on, right? At the beginning of the 19th century. But then by 1850, right? Then as about the time the Civil War is about to trigger off, you have a gold rush in California. So you have all these people who have no interest in going to Nevada. They're just passing through. They're just passing through. And then you have the Donner Party, which he talks about, we'll talk about for a second, right? That is alleged to be cannibals, right? They are traveling. They go up to what is now called Donner Pass. They get caught in the snow, right? They run out of supplies, and who knows, right? We don't have really great evidence, right? This book talks about it a little bit, or used to talk about it more, but it sort of becomes an urban legend. There's actually no like direct evidence, right? You don't see any tooth marks on bones or anything like that. So, but because of that, the reason why that matters is that some people realize, right? You get this idea, this mythos that you can't leave too late in the winter. If you're too far behind, you need to wait the winter out, right? You need to not try and make that pass in the winter because you don't want to end up like the Donner Party. And so what happens is you have a lot of people who stay over the winter in Northern Nevada, in Utah, right? And it starts to create a lot of commerce where people are settling there, right? In the next spring, they've already built a building. They've already broken down their wagon, right? They don't have the resources or they no longer have the will to go further west. And then you start developing cities and towns, right? A lot of the towns that exist today, even today, right? They exist because of travel westward. You had to have some pit stops, right? And you had some people who got to a certain point, got stuck in the winter or ran out of resources, and that's where they ended up living, right? You can see that because we live in a Western state, there are places where you're traveling and there's just a city in the middle of nowhere, right? There's nothing really around it, right? I'm from California, this happens all the time. You're traveling up the 99 or the 5 highway and there's a city, right? And why is that city there? There's nothing else around it because it's a pit stop along this travels. And the West is unique in that sense that you can actually see the way the passages used to work by where the cities are, right? Why is Bakersfield so massive? Because it's right on the other side of the mountain, right? You have all this lush produce and all this ability to live, and you have all these people who have to come through there and buy goods and services. So the gold rush really creates this idea. It helps settle this area. Well, northern Nevada, right? This is still not settled. Las Vegas isn't settled until basically the start of the 20th century when you have the rise of gambling. So a little bit of a side, let's get back to this history. So Mormons are struggling to control this area, but they also don't really want this area, right? There aren't a lot of Mormons here. It's very far from Salt Lake, right? Think historically, right, how long it would take to travel from Salt Lake to here, to Carson City. So they appoint Governor Nye. And Governor Nye is sent to establish the capital of the Nevada territory, or what becomes the county, or what they call at the time a county, right? So they're going to send out Governor Nye, and he's going to establish where the capital is. He is a Mormon. He does not want to be in Nevada. He doesn't really want to be away from Salt Lake, right? So he comes to Carson City, even though, right, that what becomes this territory is massive and there's all this southern area. He just says, I'm going to be up north and that's where I want to be. He wants to be closer to his, right, connections to Salt Lake and the Mormon community. And so Governor Nye establishes it. But what happens is that because Governor Nye establishes it there, and because he's really not that interested in controlling that territory, the Mormon, the central Utah territory, continues to ignore, right, the non-Mormons in this area. And it's not just that it's not just that they're intolerant, right? You can't really go to Utah territory, but that they don't provide services or infrastructure because they're just not that concerned about the Nevada territory. So you have this process where Nevadans, people who become Nevadans, they start to feel neglected, they start to feel that they're under some oppressive control, and they start demanding that they have their own government. So in the 1860s, right, in the 1850s, 1860s, America's going through a civil war. And this is a historical, but I'm sure you've talked about this war. I don't know how you could have gotten through high school and not talk about the Civil War. That'd be insane. But what's happening on the Civil War, right, is that because the South is left, the Republicans are in charge. All the Democrats are gone, right? The Democrats in the southern states are gone. Lincoln and his Republicans are in charge. And so they used to have a practice where whenever they admitted a free state into the Union, they'd want to admit a slave state because the southern states wanted a balance. But with the southern states gone, right, this was an opportunity for the northern Republicans, right, the Union, to bring in states and demand that they have certain things, right? So one of the things that starts to happen is the Nevada territory starts to separate from the Utah territory. And the Utah territory there's a bit of conflict, but they don't fight them at the level that they're that concerned because these aren't part of their people, right? The Mormons in Utah have already decided that we're two different groups. So while they want to maintain that territory for the economic value, they don't really see those people, right? This is very history repeating itself, right? British didn't see us as part of their subjects, right? We weren't citizens. We were part of our colonies, right? The Utah government, right? The Mormon government in Utah doesn't see Nevadans as part of Utah, right? And so you have a bit of a conflict, right? But you still eventually have this process where they want to become a state. And Utah wants to be accepted as a state instead of a territory. And so the Republican Party starts saying, okay, we want Nevada to be a state, but it's going to be on our terms, right? So start making a constitution, right? Start setting up a constitution, and then we're going to add some expectations for what you have to have in your state. So they start by basing their constitution on those of California and New York. We'll talk about when we get out of the slides, right? California and New York have very complicated legal systems, and they have very complicated constitutions. Because they had such a complicated case history, a legal case history, it gives them an expertise in some of the issues that Nevada would deal with, right? Most importantly at the time, mine taxes, right? How do you determine whose mine it is? How do you determine how to tax mines? And so they write this constitution and they decide that mine taxation will work a very specific way. The way that it will work is that instead of taxing property, right, every other property is taxed at about 15% its value, right? They levy some taxes against 15%. Like if you have a $100,000 piece of property, we're going to tax that we're going to tax 15% of that. So we're going to treat it as 15,000, and then we're going to tax about 3%. So what you end up paying, right, is like $600 on that $100,000 property. That's property taxes. What they decide with mines, with the mining industry, right, they have a lot of influence because they're the largest industry by the time we get to 1863, is that we shouldn't be taxed on property. We should get taxed on production. So if I own this massive piece of land and I claim it's a mine, but I'm not using it, then it shouldn't be taxed at all, right? It should have no taxes. And only when I start digging up ore, you tax the ore, not the property. Now, this is very problematic because if you're a farmer in Nevada and you're getting taxed on your property and not how much you're producing in your dairy or whatever meats that you're producing, then you're paying more taxes on your land than a person with a mine who's paying no taxes when their mine's not in use. And so you have this fight about it. And Dr. Bowers makes it seem like this is one of the reasons why the 1863 Constitution is not ratified. However, while it's an issue that causes tension and makes it more difficult to be ratified, the 1863 Constitution also requires that if you ratify the Constitution, if Nevada becomes a state, you have to elect the officials tied to ratification. So if you become a state in Nevada, you also elect these certain officials whose names are already listed in the ratification. And this became part of the problem. The people who wrote the Constitution said we should be in government. And it's unclear whether or not it was a rejection of those people or of the Constitution. But if I ask you in an exam, this is why, right, this ratification tied to specific candidates, that is why the 1863 Constitution is rejected. And why do we know that? Which we'll review later in a second, but I'm going to go to the next slide. Because if you look at the Constitution of 1864, so 1863, they write a constitution, it's rejected by the people in Nevada. They vote it down. So in 1864, they say, okay, let's start with the Constitution of 1863. Let's take away these candidates, right? You can elect whoever you want and you can ratify the state, right? You can elect different people and they're not tied to ratifying statehood. And then they get to the issue of mine taxation. And the issue of mine taxation doesn't really change because the taxation on mines doesn't change. Farmers are still unhappy, but the way in which we tax mines is still production and not property value. Because mine taxation doesn't change, but ratification does, and then in 1864, the Constitution is ratified and passes, and Nevada becomes a state later, right? Because it has to go through the federal government. That is the difference, right? That's why we want to say that ratification being tied to specific candidates is why it failed in 1863, because it's the key difference between 63 and 64, right? We have the benefit of history to look back and say what was different, and that is what was different between the two. Hold on, I'm going to check to see if there are any. I keep forgetting to check for questions. Okay. So that was the difference between those two things, right? That's why we want to say it was 1860. Why the reason was that ratification tied to specific candidates is because they were two different constitutions and the 1864 passes. Okay, so during this entire time period, right, Nevada is a territory until 1864. It wants to become a state. So becoming a state is a two-step process. The first part is the territory votes to be considered for statehood, right? Right now, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. It's not a state. Puerto Rico has more than once voted down becoming a state, right? More than one time they have voted down, they do not want to become a state. Now, there are some reasons why you wouldn't want to become a state, right? Taxation and things like that are a little different, but you also don't get a say in who's president. You don't get a representative in Congress. right? So it's whether or not, right, there are a lot of commonwealths, right? Saipan and Guam are a commonwealth of the United States. Technically, all of those places could vote to become a state, and that would be step one, right? But they don't. Now, some of them don't for different reasons, right? It's sort of unclear. Puerto Rico didn't want to become a state before, but they may want to now because of how badly disasters have been handled because they're not a state, right? So we'll see if Puerto Rico changes their behavior in the future of becoming a state. But even if they said we want to become a state and they voted in a referendum to become a state, they still might get allowed to, because the second step is Congress determines if the state is accepted. And this is where the Republicans in 1864 had so much power. Republicans made quite a few demands. Let me see. Okay, that was the last slide. So the Republicans under Lincoln, they have a few demands. The first demand is that slavery is banned in Nevada, which you would expect, right? When you're talking about Republicans in the Union, you have to demand that if you're going to become a state, you can't be a slave state, right? Slaves have to be banned, right? They're fighting an entire civil war, right, to end slavery. So, and sort of bring the South back in with slavery being ended. They're not going to create a new slave state. So that's step one. It's very easy. The second part is that all non-state land, all non-unincorporated land becomes federal land. And this becomes a big issue today, right? We will talk about later. If it's not a city or an incorporated area for Nevada, it becomes federal territory. So Nevada has more federal land by percentage than any other state, right? There's a lot of our land, right? All of Yucca Mountain is federal land, right? Why do we have so many bases, right? Why is Nellis here? Why are there so many buildings and institutions here that are federal? Because all of that land is federal, right? All of that land is federal, and it's very close to our cities and towns, right? So we gave up all of that land. And then a few other concessions, right? But because we were willing to give up the concessions, Nevada becomes a state, right? And this is in 1864. It actually doesn't happen in 1864. Then we create a Nevada Constitution, right? Because we have a Nevada Constitution. The Nevada Constitution has 140 amendments. The federal Constitution has 27, and it's much older, right? Why do we have 140 amendments, right? Because while the process for an amendment to occur in the federal government was very difficult, the process to amend the Nevada government is very easy, right? What is, right, we've talked about this before, but the most recent obvious example, why is it that marijuana legalization can't be fought in the courts? Because in Nevada, it was an amendment to the Constitution. That's why it was voted on twice, because Nevada amended its Constitution to say that recreational use marijuana was legal in the state, right? That's a constitutional amendment. It's not a law, it's a constitutional amendment. So the state courts have no power there, right? In 2008, because California follows a similar pattern, they voted to amend their constitution to ban same-sex marriage, right? Therefore, California courts could not stand against that, even if they wanted to, and say it was discriminatory, because it was a constitutional amendment. Because our Constitution is so easy to amend, all you have to do is vote on it twice, right, for direct democracy, which we'll talk about moving forward. It's so easy to amend that it's also very easy to violate rights or to do something that maybe wouldn't fit with the federal Constitution. And that's where we get some of these fights, right? States can do things and amend their constitutions very easily, and then it's legal and constitutional in the state because it was amended to be constitutional. But does that mean it fits with the federal government? Okay, so at this point, I am going to turn off. Please work. Okay. So I'm going to turn off the slides, but we have a test review. I was hoping this would be easier for those of you in the live stream. Like, I know it's not fun to see if I can. Oh God. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna lecture on the board for a second. and then I'm going to do a pan over for those of you in the live stream. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk for now, and then I'm going to do a pan over at the end so you can see exactly what I'm talking about on the board. I apologize, but I will do another, for all of you, I will do a video, like a test prep video. I was going to cover more, but we're going to have a shorter day, shorter than I expected. I'm going to cover these things because they sort of answer a few questions, but I can't hold the camera and see it, right? It's not like a selfie or something like that. So unfortunately, technology is still fighting with me. So the first part I want to talk about is this idea of mind leaching. And so hopefully you can see it a little bit, the picture, lighting and everything. So the idea behind mind leaching is above ground, you have an A and a B mine, right? Someone owns this mine and someone owns this mine, right? They're separate properties. And then the individual starts digging down, right? And the individual thinks they're doing this, right? This is the perception. The individual thinks they're digging straight down, right? Or they argue that they thought they were digging straight down, right? The argument in the legal case, or the perception that they say they had, right, is that they were digging straight down, and therefore whenever they find silver and gold, right, because we're talking about a silver and gold rush during the time of the Constitution, they say that's mine, right? And in California, this became so common because even if you intended to dig straight down, because we're not talking about very modern technology where you can use ultrasound to figure out where you're at in the land, you don't know, right? As soon as you get 10 feet under the ground, you can't tell if you're level anymore. You can't tell if you're going straight, right? You cannot tell in the direction you're going. So you have to dig down quite far to get to silver and gold. It's embedded fairly deep, right? So we're talking about panhandling and stuff like that. But you can get down quite far very quickly, right? And the ground in certain places is soft enough that you can sort of lose track, right? There's no daylight, there's no clear way to check. And so what happens is you end up under B, right? You end up physically under B, right? But it's very difficult to tell. And it creates questions for the legal system, right? And this is why California and New York, right? New York is much older, complicated. But why did we base our Constitution off the California Constitution? It's because they've been doing this problem for years. And what you start to have is answers to these questions, right? The first is, does B have a legal claim? Say B starts digging down, and they actually, right, get a straight line, and they run in, and then they see this tunnel. There's a tunnel leading to the other person, right? And they would claim mine leaching, right? They say, you dug into my land, and you stole this from my land, right? It's mine to cover. And so the first question is, do they have a legal claim? Should the courts force A to pay B for the mining that they did, right? Because they technically stole from their property, right? This immediately raises this question of, how do we know? How do we even tell whose land it is, right, with the technology we have in the 19th century, right? How do we decide this factor? The next part, which we're going to talk about the courts a lot moving forward, is how does the court know what to do? Remember, the court is not a moral institution. It can't just say what is right. It has to go off of this argument. We call it, for this, we call it precedent. Right? Precedent is this idea of a previous court case that was settled, determining the next court case, right? So when you start have cases like this coming up, if California's been dealing with this for years, their court system starts to get very good because of all the precedent that exists, right? Did you do this intentionally? Can we show intent? Is it unclear where the boundary is, right? If it's unclear where the boundary of the two territories are, then you don't owe that person, right, precedent, right, because you didn't know that you were taking from that individual. Or, right, we now can determine with this new technology whether or not you're in whose land, and if you buy from someone else's land, you have to pay them, right? This starts to get answered in the California court system. So when Nevada develops its constitution, it starts to look at those answers to those questions as legal answers. And because New York has had so many other issues and they're older, right, their constitutions answer a lot more questions than other states because they don't have to deal with certain things, right? Also, right, New York and California, they have some diversity, right? And what are Nevadans worried about? They're worried about being oppressed again, right? Because they felt oppressed under Mormon control. So they want to make sure there are protections. They want to make sure that government is limited, but they also want to be able to solve these questions. Excuse me. And then the last part that we discussed, the last part about this is, do you trust the courts? And in the book, they talk about how Mormon courts, because they would favor Mormons over non-Mormons, there wasn't a belief in the court system. And so the Nevada Constitution wanted some guarantees that would insulate the court to make sure it was not corrupt. Now, it ended up being extremely corrupt for a long period of time, right? Modern organized crime has more of a root in Nevada than any other state, right? It's New York City and Las Vegas, right? That's where that's where organized crime lived in the 20th century. Mostly because, right, you had New York was its historical home, but all the money laundering was occurring in casinos, right? It's very easy to run a criminal organization when you have that much cash running through, right? And this predates electronics, so no control over that cash, right? You can very quickly process it through. The next part is about mine taxation. We talked about this, but there are 3 ways to tax property, right? Tax a mine, right? It's property taxes, no taxes, and then a percentage of production, right? And the argument was always that if you have a mine, that you should not have to pay for the land, you should only have to pay for the industry that it produces. And this is, even today, this is an argument that we continue to have, right? Even today, mines do not pay property tax. They pay production tax. But if you had a different type of business, any other type of business, you pay for property taxes for almost everything. Farmers pay property taxes for the value of their land, even if it's not in use, right? So mines have this special exemption that continues to exist. As we continue talking about Nevada, it'll be very clear why they have this, right? And we'll start to, I think, either in the next exam or the third exam, we're going to talk about interest groups and lobbying, right? The mines are the powerful interest of the 19th century. They have the most money, they have the best ability to lobby. And so why is it set up this way? Not because it's better for the state of Nevada, but because it's better for the mines and they had the best lobbying group at the time, right? Why is it that rideshare is on the Strip today when it was initially banned from being on the Strip? Because rideshare has a lot of lobbying money, and they had more lobbying money than the taxi cab unions, right? So it's set up in such a way that that works. Okay, and then this last part, I really should have thought this through, is this idea of 1863 versus 1864 that I want you to reinforce. In 1863, we have the mine taxation issue. It does not change. The document is not have a significant change between the 2 constitutions, right? When you're looking at this disdain for Utah, right? In both cases, they don't want to be part of Utah, right? You definitely have, right, the basis of California and New York, right? So it's not that any of those things changed between 63 and 64. If you didn't like that it was based on California, it was in both documents. So you voted no both times. If you wanted to be part of Utah, you voted no both times. The people who switched their vote that allowed that constitution to pass, the only thing that was different, that was significantly different, because there were a lot of differences in the language, right, was that the ratification of that statehood document and that constitution was not tied to specific candidates. And I think that's what we have to make sure we reinforce. Okay, so at this point, that is the Nevada stuff. Let me go back to Web Campus. I'm going to talk about the exam. Assignment 2 is due today, so make sure you finish it if you haven't. You won't see assignment 3 until after the exam because I don't want you to like be worrying about both of those things. So on Thursday when you come in, assignment 3 will be up. For now, you have exam 1 coming up. It should pop up at midnight. I'm going to check it as we go from Sunday into Monday because it's a full 72 hours. I will check it Sunday night to make sure it like actually popped up. But if anyone has any issues where they're not seeing it work properly or anything like that, let me know early. If you go to take it Wednesday night at 11:30 and you only give yourself 30 minutes to do a 15-minute exam, and at 11:59 it closes on you, I'm only gonna give you whatever grade you earned at 11:59, right? I'm giving you 72 hours. So while you can procrastinate and wait till Wednesday night, I would suggest you don't in case there's some technological issue. As long as you get it in by 11:59 on Wednesday, right, you will be fine. And it takes about an hour. After that, unless something really dramatic happened to you, there will be no makeups. And remember, I dropped the lowest exam. So if you do really poorly in this exam, don't stress out. Don't stress out about it. You're still at a point where you can continue to do better. Make sure that's off. So now I'm actually looking at the exam. I want to go over some stuff. So I'm looking at the exam right now, and I'm talking about things that I want you to notice. This is a quick review. I will do a recorded review because I don't like that they can't see that. Make sure you understand the taxation issue. Make sure you understand why we initially came to Nevada, right? Although mine taxation becomes this bigger issue, right? Fur trapping is part of the initial reason we come in is fur trapping. Make sure that you know the Bill of Rights, right? The parts that are in the slides, right? What is the test of whether or not it violates the First Amendment? What's the name of the test that violates the First Amendment? What are the clauses in the First Amendment, right? We have the Establishment Clause, but we already have, right, the Privileges Clause, right? You have each of these different clauses and other things, right? What parts of those exist? What amendments are those, right? And if you're not sure, right, make sure you go back through the slides and just check on the amendments. And then the quiz will be slightly helpful because you can take it. It's due today, but it won't close. None of them close. So as we move forward, the quizzes you can do right before you take the exam is like a warm-up. And because it's due now and it takes the highest score, later you should be able to go back through and it won't change your score, right? But you can take it and sort of be like, okay, what kinds of questions is he gonna ask? I write my quizzes the same way I write my exams. And you can use that as a practice test before you go into the exam, sort of warm up. All right. You want to know the difference between the plans, right? What's the difference between the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, right? What was that about Congress, right? It was about representation. Do we represent by population, or do we represent equally among the states? The original capital of Nevada was Carson City. This should be a very easy question because the capital of Nevada now is Carson City, right? It has not shifted. Why it was the capital of Nevada, right? We talked about as being Governor Nye, right? Governor Nye wanted to be further north. He could have controlled the state of Nevada more easily if he had picked a more central location, right? He did not care to do that. He wanted to be closer to his right to Salt Lake, right? And the sort of Mormon culture that he was part of. Right? When we have the start of the nation, we start with the Articles of Confederation. Shays' Rebellion shows us that Articles of Confederation will not work. Then we go to the Constitution. The first government of the United States was not the Constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation. Under the Constitution, right, once we get rid of the Articles of Confederation and we go to the Constitution, under the Constitution, we start with dual federalism. Dual federalism exists, right, from that around that time period of that 19th century time period, right, early 19th century, until the New Deal, right? you have the 1929 stock market crash. You have the Democrats take over. You have the rise of the social welfare state, and that's when you get cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism brings in all the grants, right? Cooperative federalism brings in all the grants, the different types of grants, right? The project grants that you have to compete over with other states, right? The formula grants where the federal government decides how much things are going to cost for you, right? The block grants where it's more open, right? The grant system becomes tied to cooperative federalism. This exists pretty much from 1932 until 1980, right? Nixon tries to get rid of cooperative federalism, but he's not as successful. As we get into 1980, we get the beginning of what's called new federalism, right? New federalism, it has some other terminology, but I'm going to stick with new federalism. This one I've used, right? Is Reagan trying to push responsibility back to the states, right? The states should be solving problems, right? Remember that quote we discussed that I gave earlier about Reagan, right? Reagan saying the worst thing you could hear is someone say, "I'm here to help. I'm from the government," right? That was a belief by the Republicans that local government should solve problems. They introduced this idea of devolution, right? Of taking a policy and lowering it to the lowest level that it can possibly be, having the state solve these issues. Now, when we're talking about federalism, why does it matter so much? Because of the supremacy clause, right? The federal government has the supremacy clause, and the states have the 10th Amendment, and they fight, right? They intentionally fight, right? The government is set up intentionally for them to fight. Who gets it? The state or the federal government. And the reason why they can both claim power in some ways is the supremacy clause in the federal government, the Constitution, right? And the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights that gives powers not given to the federal government to the states, right? The states have anything not expressly given to the federal government. You need to know the 1st through 6th, the 8th, and the 10th Amendment. We didn't really cover the 7th and 9th. Not that they're not important, but we're going to be talking a lot about discrimination moving forward. We're going to be talking a lot about civil rights. We have not talked about civil rights yet. We've talked about civil liberties, right? Civil liberties are in this exam. Civil liberties are just limitations of the government, right? We have not talked about limits that are put on people yet, right? I want you to know the 14th Amendment. I want you to know that it extended the Bill of Rights to people in states. I want you to know that the way it was incorporated is called selective incorporation. Selective incorporation. And I know I'm going very fast, but this is going to be a recording, this review session, and then I want to try and go over the board, sort of scan over it at the end. So if you are not seeing everything, right, just remember that it's here. And then I will make one more recording on like Monday, Tuesday, so you can like have a bit of review in case I feel like I didn't cover something appropriately. Okay. I'm going to ask you some basic questions about government. Know what they are, right? Just go back to what's an oligarchy? What's an autocracy? What does it mean to be representative government? Question in the back, sorry. No. I don't think it helps you to know dates, right? I don't think it has meaning. Like, I need you to know the difference between the 63 and the 64 Constitution, but I'm not going to ask you what year. I'm going to ask you, why did the 64 pass and not the 63? I'm going to ask you those types of questions. Now, obviously, you need some reference point, but they don't have names, right? But I'm not going to ask you the year that the Bill of Rights was ratified. I'm not going to ask you the year that the 14th Amendment comes in. I'm not going to ever ask you the year of court cases. It's relevant historically, but in the context, Loving v. Virginia isn't important because it passed in 1967. It's important because it ended bans on interracial marriage. So I don't need you to remember that it was 1967. I need you to remember that it was Loving v. Virginia, right? That's the case that that's the case that ended bans on interracial marriage. Right? When we move forward, right, there will be other court cases or other things that I need you to know that are in relevance, but I will never ask you the year. It might have somewhere knowing the year gives you some reference point, And I think that is fair if like it's easier to know, right? It's easier to know through a year, but I will never ask you like, what year did this happen? I don't think that's effective, right? You have history classes for that. And then the difference between that, and for those of you, right, dates are not expected to be known, right? If I change that, I will make it very clear. I think it's important to know the historical context, but the specific date and year, I don't think is that relevant to your knowledge, right? Because you'll remember it just for this class and then you'll abandon it. Whereas something like mind leaching could be in your brain for the rest of your life, where you're explaining like complicated legal situations or nuance in an argument, right? That might help you long term, but a lot of the dates won't be helpful. And honestly, if I took a test with like historical dates, I'd probably fail. So it's unfair for me to give you a test asking you to know all this stuff and I don't know it, right? That doesn't seem appropriate. Okay. Yeah, you need to know oligarchy, you need to know democracy, you need to know autocracy, right? What do those terms mean? Now, if you're not sure, they're in my slides. If at any point you're like, I don't know the difference between a representative government and a totalitarian government, it's in my slides, right? All of that is there, right? Don't feel like you can't use my resources to better an exam. In fact, if you are like, oh, I hit this question and I'm not sure, I don't lock down your browser. Go into my slides. Use my notes or your notes, right? Use your notes, use my slides, use the lectures if you have time, right? Whatever resources that you have that don't involve asking another person are fine, right? I never want to put you in that position, right? And because we're not taking a test in class, it disadvantages the people who don't cheat if I say you can't use your notes. Because some of you will take that and brain that and you won't use your notes when you take the exam. But most of the people in an online exam will just open their book if they're not sure, right? And so I'm only punishing the people who have their own morality cues about cheating. I'm not actually distributing that like restriction on everyone. So if you need your notes or if you're not sure, look for that answer. Just don't spend too much time looking for that answer. All right, you need to know how long people are elected for, right? How long is the president elected for? How long is the House of Representative individual elected for? How long is the senator is elected for? What percentage of the House is reelected every election cycle? What percentage of the Senate is reelected every election cycle? What ratio of states has to ratify a constitutional amendment for it to pass? Now, I'm using this term ratio and percentage. Just know that I mean 3/4. 3/4 is a ratio, right? I'm not trying to trip you up with language, right? 3/4 of the states have to ratify an amendment for it to pass, for it to become a constitutional amendment of the federal government, right? 100% of the people in the House of Representatives have to go through the election cycle every election cycle, right? No one is spared a re-election in the House, right? Everyone. In the Senate, it's a third or 33%, right? If you feel tripped up about that, right, that's something you can email me about. Right, you're like, I like math is not my strong suit. We can discuss that, but I feel like 33% and a third is not too demanding, right? Or 3/4 of states. But most of you went to Clark County School District, right? It has its flaws, right? If you're not sure about something I say, email me. I will always be willing to talk to you. I answered like 300 emails this weekend, so not from you, but just in general. I'm very used to responding to emails. So if you have a question, even if you don't feel like it's a fully thought out, I'm going to respond. And by now you should know that I like to talk and I like to do this. I do the same thing when I'm typing. I don't have I will give you a very detailed response. So if you ever have a question, don't feel like you shouldn't ask me. I'd much rather be answering your questions than questions from the bureaucracy here, right? I'd much rather be working as an instructor than as a bureaucrat. Okay. You need to know the different types of powers. What's an express power, right? What is an implied power? How do we get implied powers? Remember that Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution talks about necessary and proper clause. That creates, right, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The necessary and proper clause creates the ability to have implied powers. Implied powers means I need more powers, or I need something else to complete the task I was given by having these expressed powers, right? The Congress was given the power to regulate, Congress was given the power to regulate commerce, declare war, right? The only way it can regulate commerce is to say that the implied power that comes along with that is that I have to have a centralized bank. I have to have, right? I have to have an IRS to run taxation. If I'm going to regulate commerce, I need all of these other powers to actually accomplish that task, right? And so that becomes this problem, right? Jefferson argues this, right? That everything then becomes necessary for you to do your job, right? But that's an implied power, and the only reason we have implied power is a necessary and proper clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Okay. Make sure that that it should be quite clear. If I don't say, like, if it's not clear that it's Nevada, I'm talking about the federal government, right? There are a few questions where it's not perfectly clear, and I don't want to rewrite the exam because I don't want to mess anything else up. If it's not perfectly clear that I'm talking about Nevada, it should be the federal government. But every question should be very, very clear, right? There should only be one or two where you're like, is he talking about, if you're not sure if I'm talking about Nevada or the federal government, assume the federal government. And then if you get it wrong, email, right? If I make a mistake on the exam, I will fix your grade because of my mistake. I don't punish you for my mistakes, right? So that won't happen. And there are a few questions where it should be clear to me, it's clear to me that I'm talking about the federal government, but that's not fair because I've done this for so long that it may not be clear to you. All right. There are 3 branches of government, right? 3 branches of government. They are judicial, executive, legislative. Congress is not a branch of government. The president is not a branch of government, right? The Supreme Court is not a branch of government. The branches of government are judicial, legislative, executive. The president belongs to the executive branch. The Supreme Court belongs to the judicial branch, right? Congress belongs to the legislative branch of government. So branches are the parts of government. They are generic in their terminology. Congress and the president are specific parts of those branches. When we talk about checks and balances, branches have checks and balances on each other. People in roles do not, right? Senator Booker does not have a check on the president. Congress, right? Congress does not have a check on the president. The legislative branch has a check on the president, determined by the Constitution, right? It's determined by, not by laws, the Constitution determines what checks that branch has in another branch. Because Congress isn't the only part of the legislative branch, right? It's a much larger bureaucracy with a lot of other moving parts that also work, right, to put a check on the executive branch. Okay. So there's this term, it's called amicus curiae. If you see it, that's the wrong answer. We didn't cover it yet, right? In fact, if you see a term and you're like, I don't think we ever covered this, I'm not trying to trip you up. Really not. We're going to talk about it later. I want you to, one of these things I'm sort of testing out is some of the terms you see in the exam, they're not things you are expected to know yet, but that we will eventually cover, right? So if you see something like amicus curiae, it means friend of the court. It's a briefing that you give to a court to sort of argue for yourself. It's a document, but it's not relevant for this exam. It won't be relevant until we talk about judicial systems. But we have talked about precedent, right? Precedent is a term that you should know, right? Judicial review, right? Judicial review is the way that the judicial branch determines laws are unconstitutional, right? Marbury versus Madison is the case that gave them judicial review, right? So those are the things that are expected to know. So if you see a term, I want you to get more used to this because amicus curiae becomes a term that everyone struggles with later on. It's the wrong answer in this exam. It is not an answer that you should take. So if you run into it and there's a term in Latin and you're like, I don't know what that means. Remember, if I didn't cover it, it's not the answer to a question. That doesn't mean it's not in the exam, it's just not the answer to a question. Okay. Influence in government is called political efficacy. Your ability to influence the government is called political efficacy. The competition over influence is called pluralism. Competition over influence is called pluralism. So you might think that politics means that's influence, right? Politics is the battle, right? Pluralism is the interests competing, right? Political efficacy is how good are they at competing, right? Politics is the larger conflict that's occurring, right? And all of these are defined. All of these are defined in my slides. Okay. The last thing, because I think I've given you a lot of information, and I'm going to do one more video. It'll probably be a shorter video. Is that we as Americans are very concerned with liberty and equality of opportunity, right? Liberty and equality of opportunity, right? We're not concerned about equality of outcome, right? Equality of outcome is where we all end up with sort of a similar, it's the same thing, right? All of you want to end up with a bachelor's or some version of a degree, right? But because you're in this classroom, you don't think, okay, we all deserve the same degree, right? Or the same GPA, right? All of you believe that your efforts should be treated equally, right? How much should I put in should be tied to how much you get out. And we should all have this equal equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity just means that you here in this country are allowed to use whatever wealth and talent and skill that you have to maximize your potential, right? That doesn't mean you're getting a fair starting point. It's just that no one should be allowed to stand in the way of your talent and skill to get to where you want to be. That is equality of opportunity. Liberty is that the government should stay out of your way. And throughout this entire semester, we're going to run into this problem. The government should be out of the way. There should be limits on government. Government shouldn't interfere in my life. But at times, you're going to need the government to guarantee equality of opportunity. I cannot get into this school because it doesn't allow minorities. I can't get this scholarship because it's only for men, right? I am not allowed into this program because it doesn't provide for any opportunities for people of different faiths, right? All of these are things that limit equality of opportunity, and you want the government to step in, but right, liberty is at odds with that. Right? We're always trying to find this balance between liberty and equality, right? Equality requires the government intervention, liberty stops government intervention. So you're always trying to find the balance between those two things. And as we move forward and this becomes more clear with civil rights, right? What is that balance? But for now, liberty, limits on government, equality of opportunity, right? The government stepping in to balance that initial starting point. Okay, so at this point, right, I covered everything. Before you guys go, I'm going to see if I can pan across this board. See if we can do it very slowly. Let's close this so I don't accidentally show it to those who are doing the live stream. So let's see what we get here. Okay, so, oh my God, I'm so bad at this. So this is my chain. No, this is not going to work. Okay. I will send you guys photos because that's not going to work. So at this point, I'm going to end the live stream. If you have any questions, right, email me. If you have any issues, let me know. And you guys are free to go.